From here to the stars. I am your host, Stephen Euin Cobb. Our guest today is Dr. Evie Kendal. Dr. Kendal is an emerging technology bioethicist and public health scientist whose research includes artificial womb technology, ethical issues in aerospace medicine, planetary defense, and public health education. Our guest today is Dr. Evie Kendal. Dr. Kendal is an emerging technology bioethicist and public health scientist whose work focuses on reproductive biotechnologies, health communication and media, and space ethics. She is a lecturer of health promotion at Swinburne University of Technology's Department of Health Sciences and Biostatistics. She heads the Ethical, Legal, and Social Implications of Emerging Technologies Research Group, housed at the Iverson Health Innovation Research Institute. Her research interests include artificial womb technology, ethical issues in aerospace medicine, planetary defense, and public health education. Doctor, you are scheduled to speak on a panel at the 8th Symposium of the Interstellar Research Group, which will be held this summer, July 10 to 13, 2023 at McGill University in Montreal, Canada. The panel is billed as a Sagan Meeting after the style of panel which Carl Sagan developed. The topic will be, how would you select a crew for the first interstellar mission? Since some in our audience will not be at the symposium, what are some of the points you want to emphasize?
Thank you so much for this interview. So the panel, at least the part that I'll be talking about, will be looking at how we can maintain human diversity in a really small set of people that we send, say, to an off-world human settlement. So I'm very interested in making sure we have non-discriminatory selection processes for this situation, and that we do our best to maintain all of the diversity of human experience that we can. So my primary interest there is looking at the risk when it comes to reproductive liberty if we only choose young, reproductively sort of fit individuals. So, for example, we definitely want to make sure we have lots of different skill sets, lots of different cultural views, obviously representation from the LGBTI community, and focusing on just reproducing in this new human habitation would really limit some of that diversity if that was going to be our primary objective. But even more problematic is the kind of pressure it would put on those people. So when we're talking about reproductive liberty, we're talking about the freedom to decide if you want to have children, and if so, how many and when and with whom. So if we suddenly say you've only been chosen for this mission because we want you to have lots of babies, essentially the problem we have there is we're essentially setting up reproductive slavery. So that's a real problem that we need to think through before we start selecting people for these kinds of missions. So again, that's my primary concern there. But as a secondary issue, of course, diversity is better for a group. So we have different ideas coming through, different problem solving sort of solutions coming from different perspectives. So preserving that diversity is actually really good for the team itself and what it can actually achieve. So just looking at how can we set up the rules and guidelines for selection before that kind of mission goes forward.
Okay. Doctor, you've written a book and also co-edited a book, both of which I will ask about. But first, I want to ask about two pieces you wrote concerning space. You contributed a chapter to the book Planetary Defense, Global Collaboration for Defending Earth from Asteroids and Comets. Your chapter is titled No Conscience of Its Own, The Need for Global Space Ethics Review. What are some of the points you made in that chapter?
So that particular chapter was looking at ethically analysing different methods of planetary defence. So essentially, if there's an impact hazard for Earth, and that can be asteroidal or cometary or a variety of other things, what do we actually do? And as a planet, how do we collaborate in a way that doesn't sacrifice some zones of the planet for others? So we don't want to be in a situation where we're redirecting an asteroid to a different area to save our own people. So that's one of the things we're looking at. But essentially just doing an analysis of what is going to be the most ethical way to deal with this potential threat. And the technologies that were being reviewed included things like kinetic impactors. So essentially when we send a rocket up there to bump the asteroid out of its current path, and gravity tractors doing very similar, except using gravitational force to actually pull it to a different trajectory. And then, of course, we've got the nuclear option, which usually the Planetary Defense Conference every year goes with something nuclear. So we're trying to think about, okay, what are the political ramifications of relying on that tech? Even though we do have sort of proof of concept there, obviously politically it's very problematic if people start stockpiling nukes in space and say it's only for planetary defense, or of course if they're stockpiling them here. And the other alternative was a theoretical moon laser that the team working on that project was sort of theorizing. So they wanted to have a high power laser on the dark side of the moon that would also be involved in powering a mining facility. So looking at what if we actually, shot down a laser with lasers, any of these impact hazards. So it was a very interesting project. It was one of the first ones I worked on for space ethics, and getting to see some of the sort of blueprints for how this tech might work was really interesting. So just considering what are the ramifications of pursuing each one of these technologies, what are the pros and cons scientifically. Obviously, some of them take longer. We need more prep time to sort of execute some of these plans, whereas some of the sort of later ones, like the nuclear options, do work in very short time frames. So if we came across something really suddenly, that tends to be why that option is usually considered. But just what can we do that's not going to exacerbate those political issues and sort of undermine the deproliferation project that we've been working on as a global community for the last few decades?
Could you talk about the response time a little bit? I mean, I don't know how fast the response time would need to be. Do you have a sense of that? And can we match that response time?
Well, it's actually really difficult because in a lot of cases, if something was coming toward us, we might know years in advance, in which case we might be able to put together one of these other projects like a kinetic impactor. So that one takes a shorter amount of time than the gravity tractors because they tend to be very large. And of course, the nuclear is the short-term option. The moon laser, of course, doesn't yet exist. So if it were to exist, obviously, it would be a very rapid response option as well. But again, we'd need the lead time to actually build it in the first place. And that's the challenge there. So I think the reason the Planetary Defense Conference often ends up taking the nuclear option is because it is short term. So they don't need as much warning that something is coming at us. But the next best in terms of existing tech with a shorter sort of lead time, I believe, are the kinetic impactor options because they can be quite small, relatively speaking.
Okay. You also contributed a chapter to the book, Human Factor in the Settlement of the Moon, an Interdisciplinary Approach. Your chapter is titled Environmental and Occupational Ethics in Early Lunar Populations, Establishing Guidelines for Future Off-World Settlements. What are some of the ideas that you emphasized in your chapter?
Yeah, that one was quite interesting because I heard about a project that was going forward and reached out to the editors, say, what do you need? And they say, OH&S. And you're like, well, that sounds a little bit boring, doesn't it? But they're like, no. It is space OH&S, which makes it much cooler. So I was like, okay. So I started reading work like Cockle, who talks about the sort of inherent tyranny of space. So he says it's inherently tyranny prone because there will be very few people out there, and people that get authority and power will actually have a lot of power. Potentially, unless we have systems in place that limit that. So imagine that you want to do mining. There's a mining facility on the moon. You go up there. The working conditions are terrible and they want you to work 20 hours a day and they're not paying you anything. But if you object to that, you can no longer live in the facility, which means you don't have any oxygen. So when we say it's tyranny prone, it's that kind of power over other people. So it's very different to on Earth if you decide that you don't want to engage with social rules, you don't want to sort of be connected to other people in that way. you can technically go off grid, you can technically live off the land if you've got those skills. But in space, you have none of those options. So you have to fit in with whatever regime has been set up. Otherwise, you don't have any food, you don't have any water, you don't have any air. So it's a very unique situation where your employer could literally withhold your ability to live, your very, very basic survival needs. So looking at how do we actually manage work contracts and work safety in that kind of environment? So the main points I was putting forward were, of course, that we need occupational health and safety rules, that they need to be enforced, which of course will be very difficult at such a long distance, but also things like renegotiating contracts should not occur once you've left Earth. So the contracts and the conditions should be ironed out here when people are able to just walk away, which is something that would not necessarily be the case once they've left. And the final point was, of course, people have to have the right to come home. So given the enormous expense that that would entail, I was arguing that companies that want people to work off-world would have to guarantee that return trip if someone didn't like it, they don't want to work there anymore, they don't want to live there anymore, they want to come back to Earth. Just in terms of making sure that we actually preserve people's freedom as much as we possibly can under those very extreme conditions.
Okay. The last person I interviewed was, oh, I forget his name right now. That's kind of embarrassing. But he was a space lawyer, and he was the second space lawyer that I've interviewed in the last few years. And most people don't even think space law is a thing, but everything you just described sounds like a subset of space law.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it's funny because there's quite a lot of space law out there, and it's always interesting to see what analogies do we have to Earth-based law, and keeping in mind that one of the main problems we have with this idea of selecting people to go to another planet is on Earth, our laws are completely inconsistent, country to country and even state to state. So if we had, say, a mining facility and one country has labor laws that says you can't work more than 8 hours, but another country says we allow our people to work for 12 hours, what do you do when those people have to live together in close quarters in the same facility? Do you actually say, okay, everyone has to abide by the same set of rules when it comes to worker safety and employment labor law? Do we come up with a new set of laws just for that facility? What kind of choices are we going to make there? And where we have a lot of gaps, people often default to, like maritime law. So if we don't know what's going to happen, people say, okay, well, what do they do in maritime law? And sort of try and figure it out from there. Like one of the questions that I really want answered is, can you get married in space? We know that we're going to have space tourists. I mean, can you imagine the destination wedding? We're going to go to Mars for our wedding. Obviously, if we're having space tourism, that kind of question is going to come up. And is that going to be legal? Is it going to be you're legally married in the country that you launched from? Is it going to be you're legally married in the country of the captain of the vessel who does it? I don't know, but it's going to be very interesting to see how those kind of legal questions get resolved. But space ethics is much younger, actually. So space law, because it already had some of these other legal systems like international law and maritime law to look at. Space ethics has been a little more recent. So there's fewer people actually working in that area. And ideally, the ethical questions get ironed out before the law gets written. Ideally, that's what we like to see. It's often not the case. We often have a problem occurs, the law has to step in, and then the ethics start debating whether the right thing was done. But we have an opportunity at the moment to iron out some of those ethical issues before we have people living long-term in space, if that's where we're headed.
And his name was A.J. Link.
Fantastic.
Yes, a colleague of yours. Sorry, AJ, if you're watching this video. My word. Let's see. I mentioned in the intro that you had the Ethical, Legal, and Social Implications of Emerging Technologies Research Group at the Iverson Health Innovation Research Institute. What are the goals of this research group, and what actions has it taken to achieve those goals?
Yeah, so major goals include actually just getting people from STEMs, the sciences, and people from HAS, the humanities and social sciences, to actually work together. So we have members who are lawyers and scientists and engineers, and a lot who are ethicists. We have people working in media. So at the moment, I think there's maybe 40 members. It's an international group, and they're from many different institutions. And the major thing that we have done so far is a conference in Geneva, in Switzerland, at the Brochet Foundation. So we actually hosted a symposium there on epigenetics, and particularly epigenetic studies involving First Nations groups and the ethical and legal social implications of these emerging technologies in genetic testing and big data, so data privacy, all of those kinds of issues, particularly relating to First Nations groups. So we had a number of First Nation members from many different countries that actually spoke both at that conference and the virtual version that we ran the year before because of COVID travel restrictions. So people can actually still listen to the one that was online because that was recorded. And essentially, we're publishing a collection of articles from that symposium. So that's our current project, looking at, just that emerging tech and what are the ethical issues there.
Okay. One of your research areas is ethical issues in aerospace medicine. What do you feel needs to be addressed in this area? Are we falling short? What changes need to be made to help us do better?
I think one of the things that we need to focus on is presently the people who have been in space have been very physically fit. So they've been obviously astronauts, they go through training. There's a lot of control over the physical fitness of these astronauts, and they train for a very long time to get up in space. Whereas we're moving to a point where people will commercially just be able to buy a ticket to space. That is essentially where we're heading. And we don't have control over those elements anymore. So we have to decide, do we want to make it mandatory to do some sort of physical fitness test before you can be a space tourist? Or is that just going to be discriminatory? What happens when someone decides that they want to have a baby in space? We've never done that. We don't know how that works. We don't know how fetal development is going to be affected by microgravity, for example. And that brings us to anything we do in space when it comes to people's health, and particularly because one of my major interests is reproduction in space. Anything we do in that area is going to be experimental. And then we run into all those research ethics challenges. If people are in space and they really don't have many options, so if we bring it back to the workers on the moon, if someone decides they want to do a research project on, health, respiratory health in mining on the moon, people have very limited options if their employer comes up to them and says, do you want to do this research trial? Do you want to take this experimental drug? And so we're really concerned about the rights of those people to refuse to be involved in experimentation and to have their sort of personal medical data protected. At the moment, of course, everyone in space is being very closely monitored in terms of their vital signs, etc. So there's a privacy issue that comes into that as well. But when you're trained for it and you understand it and you've received a lot of information about it, it's probably safer to say that those people understand what they're signing up for than a random tourist who decides that they've got the money and they just want to go out into space. So deciding what is safe when it comes to physical bodies in space, it's a very extreme environment. It's very hostile to human survival. What is safe there? What should we let people do? And what kind of experimentation are we going to allow, given the fact that some of it will just be organically occurring anyway? Because again, the first person who gets pregnant in space is going to be the N of one trial for human space pregnancy, whether they want to be or not. So that information is going to be very important for aerospace medicine. But there's a lot of challenges when it comes to privacy and consent and all those typical sort of research ethics questions. In terms of other areas of aerospace medicine, we simply don't have the information because we have not been able to engage in any sort of experimentation in many different areas. It's very exciting to see that some space programs are now looking at differently abled bodies in space. So Traditionally, of course, if you had a disability, you were disqualified from going into space, and that is changing. So we do know there's a number of programs where that is being challenged, and people are being trained for space travel that do have a number of different disabilities, and seeing how will these bodies cope in the stress of space. So yeah, very interesting, exciting times. But again, it's a little bit scary. We don't have a lot of this information.
Yeah, yeah. Doctor, you wrote a book entitled Equal Opportunity and the Case for State-Sponsored Ectogenesis, which is available on Amazon in hardcover, paperback, and Kindle versions. First off, if you would define ectogenesis.
Yeah, so it's actually quite interesting. I used the term ectogenesis because I started writing that book, I think, back in 2012, and it got published in 2015. And at that time, that was the term that everyone used just to refer to the growing of, say, a human fetus outside of the body of a woman or a person, pregnant person. So we're looking at fetuses essentially being grown in artificial wombs. And now, if you look it up, you'll find there's like 7 or 8 different terms that people use for this technology. So, like artificial amnion and placental technologies is a really common one. And some people still use artificial wombs, and some people will refer to it as ectogestation. So, lots of different words that you'll come across. But I was just using the traditional word at the time, which just meant, growing a fetus outside of the womb, so the organic womb, and looking at what kind of technologies might work. And because, of course, it was written back in 2012, a lot of the tech that has come out since then is obviously not mentioned, because there has been quite a lot of development in that area in the last few years. And the first prototype for human testing is actually being built in the Netherlands now. But a really important focus there is they are only interested in premature infants, so infants that are otherwise going to either struggle to survive or not survive because they are born at too young gestational ages. Whereas a lot of my interest is in full ectogenesis, which would actually be from conception to delivery, whatever that means in that context. So the trials that are actually being run, the prototypes that are being built, and of course we have several that have been used for animal trials in the last few years in a number of countries. The scientists working in those areas are only interested in neonatology. So they're looking at saving premature infants rather than any sort of replacement for biological gestation. So when you sort of tie it in with the space idea, I mentioned the issue of, reproductive slavery and pressure on people to have babies if they're in a new sort of fledgling space inhabitant. And if we have something artificial that can take over that role, it actually might help alleviate some of those stresses for those new members of the community. So if we have this new space habitation and we don't want people to be selected for reproductive physiology, and we don't want them to be pressured into having children, or perhaps it will actually come to be known that it's unsafe to biologically gestate in space. We don't know that yet. Having an artificial alternative could actually be very meaningful in that context.
I've written a whole series of questions on this topic, but yesterday I watched a video. You mentioned caring for premature children, babies. In the video, the woman emphasized that a lot of the research over the years has been spotty for different areas of the caring of the child, but a lot of the research in premature children and premature babies has really extended earlier and earlier and earlier, and it seems to be on a trend to engulf maybe the entire cycle. Is that possible, or is that your take? Is that your impression?
That is my impression, but it is not shared among a lot of scientists. A lot believe that there is about 10 weeks in the process that they don't realistically think we'll be able to substitute artificially. I'm hopeful that we will. Partly because of what you're describing, we're actually closing the gap on both ends. So we have seen a lot of development in terms of in vitro technologies. So we know that the rule had always been that you couldn't keep an embryo in a petri dish for longer than 14 days. That was never a problem because no one had ever managed to extend it to that point anyway. But that was the rule because that's the formation of the primitive streak. essentially when the embryo decides that it's going to be a single actual human infant. So that's the pathway that it's committed to at that point. Before that, there's a lot of different things that happen with this material, essentially. So a lot of it doesn't ever actually become a human being. So before that point, experimentation was often allowed. But having the 14-day maximum there was a rule that we kept to, but it wasn't actually bumping up against any scientific research because no one was actually progressing it that far anyway. Very recently, that did change. In the UK, there were scientists who found, I think we might actually be able to do it. And we can't because it's not legal, so they had to discontinue. But they had the tech and they were thinking, actually, this probably could keep going. We probably could keep this alive longer in the Petri dish. And as you've mentioned, on the other end, we've got prematurity. More extreme premature infants are actually surviving. So we have records of, healthy infants from 22 point something weeks gestation. And again, eventually we might actually close the whole space. But we don't really know. And some of the research into the artificial womb is very interesting because they're actually trying to come up with a way such that the fetus can be transported from inside the organic womb into the artificial womb without ever leaving the sort of watery bag that they're creating for it. So having the fluid-filled sac connected to the womb that's essentially being opened like a cesarean section, and having a bag connected to that that's full of fluid and actually just moving the fetus across while it stays encased in the fluid means that the fetus does not try to breathe. It doesn't try to engage the neonatal physiology. So it will actually retain its fetal physiology, which means it's not breathing through its lungs and its heart is not, engaging the same way that it does once it's born. So it's actually quite a different system there.
Mm-hmm.
And if we can maintain the fetal physiology, then we can actually let that entity grow to the point where it will survive, as opposed to it trying to breathe when it just can't, it trying to close, chambers of its heart and just not being able to do it because it's too young.
Mm-hmm. The technology, of course, does not exist yet to do, full term. But
No.
do you have any notion, or do you even want to stick your neck out and guess how long it might be before we could carry a child full term?
Well, it's interesting because when I started looking at this, I found estimates from we should have done it 50 years ago to it's definitely never happening ever to it's going to happen in 2 years. And this was, of course, back in, the early 2010s. So obviously it did not happen in 2 years. And we've had people working on artificial gestation since at least the 1950s in animal models, and probably further back than that. So looking at how far have we progressed in that time, obviously we do have some animal models that we've managed in, say, lambs, goats, etc., that kind of species. And they have managed to grow these from certain stages in development to being fully developed and healthy. So that is encouraging, but a lot of that was they were still grown for quite a substantial early period inside of their mother. So looking at what are we going to do in terms of, again, that experimentation, the ethics of experimenting with this tech. Because if we don't know if it's going to work, obviously there is an entity there that's taking all the risk. And that entity may turn into a person. If it works and they survive, obviously that will be a person who has undergone an incredible amount of risk that they did not agree to. And that is one of the issues we have in reproductive medicine in general. So, things like IVF, when they first started using that, they didn't know if it was going to work. And of course, the IVF embryos weren't agreeing to anything any more than any other embryo has ever agreed to be born or gestated in any particular environment or undergo whatever hazards they come across in development. So it is a real challenge because eventually we might have a person come out of that system, and we don't know how they're going to feel about how they were grown.
And for those listeners who are not familiar with the term IVF, if you would, what is
Of
that
course.
thing?
Yeah, so in vitro fertilization, so essentially when people struggle to fall pregnant naturally, they will often get assistance and we basically call it, third-party involvement. So, there's a medical practitioner that will sort of inseminate the embryos. So essentially we've got the ova that are harvested from the woman, we have the sperm harvested from the male, and they will engage in the process outside of the body. So sometimes that involves overcoming a variety of morphological challenges or functional challenges. So if the sperm don't swim very well, it can be easier just to inject them directly into the egg. So that's one way that we get past some of these issues that might be affecting a couple's fertility.
Okay. And the last question in this category, how does this relate to equal opportunity?
Yeah, so my concern with that particular book was we have a situation at the moment where if, say, a couple, a heterosexual couple, want to have children, they want to have biological children, the woman essentially has to be pregnant to achieve that, whereas the man does not. So it's a very unequal distribution of reproductive labor. And of course, when we start looking at the rights of people from the LGBTI community, we're thinking even more complex because some of those couplings don't have a womb between them, or they don't have other elements required for reproduction as a couple. So we have a number of technologies already available for a lot of people. So in some areas, you can access surrogacy to access a womb, but in many jurisdictions, you can't. And for a lot of people, they're ethically concerned about exploitation of surrogates as well. So they're not necessarily going to access that option, even when it is available. And for most people, it realistically isn't available. It's very expensive, and there's a number of legal challenges there. But for, say, lesbian couples, many of them can access sperm donation, so they can sort of get past that obstacle fairly easily. But say a gay male couple that can't access surrogacy, of course, as I said, there is no womb between them. So that's a real obstacle to them having biological children. So we're looking at different ways that perhaps both of those members could also be genetic parents. There's a number of technologies involved there. So creating gametes from non-reproductive cells is another area of sort of research that's going on. But just in terms of, if we bring it back to our traditional heterosexual couple, if the woman does not want to be pregnant or it's not safe for her to be pregnant, then options are really limited. Whereas the men just simply don't have that limitation for them. So they don't have to be pregnant. They don't have to go through childbirth. There's a very unequal distribution of the sort of health hazards involved there. So there's a safety issue. There's obviously women for whom it is unsafe to be pregnant. And of course, an artificial alternative might be desirable for some of those. But even just people who don't want to be pregnant, because for men, that's always an option. You always have the option of not being pregnant as man. Whereas that is not the case for a lot of women. So there's a lot of unwanted pregnancies, but there's also a lot of people who desperately want to have biologically related children. And obviously, when we're talking about artificial womb technology and ectogenesis, we are basically talking about people who want to be like biologically related to these children, because of course many people are foster parents and step parents and adoptive parents, and that's a beautiful thing, of course. But again, it's meeting a different need, and it's a different set of preferences. So for people who can't gestate, who want to be biologically related to their children, it would provide additional options. Doesn't solve everyone's problems, but it does solve a very unique problem.
That was Dr. Evie Kendal. This has been From Here to the Stars, a video series produced by the Interstellar Research Group. The IRG is a non-profit organization dedicated to thoroughly exploring the science and engineering that can eventually open up the reality of interstellar travel. Find out more about our next symposium at irg.space. I have been your host, Stephen Euin Cobb. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, and you can subscribe to our channel for other such videos. On behalf of all of us here at the Interstellar Research Group, I thank you.